Testing, 1, 2. Test, okay. One, two, test, test, test. Do you hear me? Okay, good.
get this going. The committee will come to order. Committee will come to order, and people can close the doors. Much appreciated. Members can take their seats. Today we are here to pass a bill that can dismantle Obamacare and reach the president's desk. We're going to repeal the 5 worst parts of the law: 2 mandates, 2 taxes, and 1 board of bureaucrats. These 5 are the core of the law and the core of the problem as we see it. Before Obamacare, people didn't buy health insurance because it was too expensive. Now they don't have a choice. The law forces them to buy it and then taxes them for it. Stop and soak in that logic. If you ran a grocery store, would you sell a loaf of bread by throwing out all the others? If you ran a dealership, would you sell a car by junking all the rest? The thinking is, if people won't make the right choice, don't give them a choice at all. The truth is, if people won't buy the product, there's probably something wrong with the product. Only Washington bureaucrats would think there's something wrong with the people. The problem with healthcare is that it is too expensive. And for too many people, the law makes it more expensive by taking away people's choices. If your insurance company charges too much, what are you going to do? They all charge too much, and now you have to buy it. The other side says it's for our own good. But what good is it to pay more and to get less? Why pay higher premiums for lower quality? Why pay for a Ferrari and drive home in a jalopy? It raises another question. Why stop there? Well, I do want to repeal the entire law. Every page, every sentence, every syllable. In fact, 2 other committees are working to repeal other parts of the law today and tomorrow. And this is our best shot at getting a bill to the president's desk. Right now, we need 60 votes in the Senate to send a full repeal to the president's desk. That's 60 votes we do not have. But under the Senate rules, we need only 51 votes to pass legislation that helps us meet our budget objectives, and this is one of our primary budget objectives. In other words, the bill has to focus on taxes and on spending. And under the budget we passed last year, or this year, this committee is responsible for producing at least $1 billion in savings. These 5 changes would hit that target. These 5 changes would hit our budget instructions, and they comply with the Senate's so-called Byrd Rule. All of them deal with taxes and spending. So if we pass this package, we can finally get a bill that takes apart Obamacare through the Senate. And we can finally confront the president with the reality confronting working families every single day. We would take this debate out of the realm of the abstraction and boil it down to 5 questions. Do you really think that we should force people to buy insurance? And do you really think that we should tax them on top of it? Should we really force job creators to pay all of these costs? Should we really tax medical devices, the very things that save our lives? And do you really think that we should turn over Medicare to a board of 15 unelected bureaucrats? Not too many people would say yes to that. So why insist on the status quo? Why not work for something better? These bills would be 5 steps. No, these bills would be 5 leaps toward tearing down this terrible law. They would dismantle this unworkable law. And they would lay the foundation for a truly affordable, high-quality, patient-centered system. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Mr. Levin. Any comments that he might want to make?
Well, here it goes. There are so many serious issues that this committee could be grappling with today, issues that could impact families across this country, issues that could draw inspiration from the Pope's address to Congress just last Thursday. No, today we are seemingly taking the next step after the Speaker's announcement on Friday to appease the right wing of the Republican conference. Want to avoid a government shutdown? Force the Speaker out. Want to avoid a government shutdown? Attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Want to avoid a government shutdown? find a new vehicle to defund women's health care. Today's markup is not a serious exercise in legislating. Everyone knows the president won't sign this reconciliation bill. That may be one of the motivations for this bill. Pure politics to send a bill to the president that he is sure to veto, and a veto will be upheld. You know how this could be avoided? Pass a CR with a combination of Democratic votes. Work with Democrats. Work with the administration on a bipartisan basis to actually get something done. Do away with the majority of the majority rule that strangulates bipartisan efforts. This is a waste of time for members of Congress, particularly as we close in on the end of another fiscal year without a responsible approach to the appropriations needed to keep our government functioning. These budget proposals are a blatant attempt to appeal to the far right, while the majority postpones having to actually govern until December. We ought to be focusing on things that matter to hardworking Americans under the jurisdiction of this committee, including financing a long-term highway bill, impacting the TPP negotiations, and reforming our tax system to address income inequality and create good-paying jobs in the U.S. Rather than working to keep the government open for a full year and providing security for our economy, Republicans are focusing on pushing through these bills that effectively gut the Affordable Care Act and the protections that it provides to working families. The Affordable Care Act is working. Since enrollment began in 2013, the uninsured rate in the country has dropped to historic lows, currently just over 11%. Millions more have gained critical protections. No more lifetime or annual coverage limits. No more pre-existing condition exclusions. Healthcare prices are rising at a slower rate than at any time in the past 50 years, benefiting taxpayers and consumers. Tens of thousands of lives and billions of dollars have been saved due to a reduction in hospital-acquired conditions such as infections. Since the passage of the law, the private sector has added 13 million jobs, and we have not seen the rise of a part-time economy as predicted by opponents. The effect of just one provision in this legislation today, repeal of the individual mandate, would increase premiums in the individual market by 20%. 14 million would lose insurance coverage. 14 million. The individual mandate ensures that there's a balanced risk pool and allows consumers to obtain affordable coverage without being discriminated against because of a pre-existing condition, their profession, or their gender. Last week we heard, and I quote, "A good political leader always opts to initiate processes rather than possessing spaces," end of quotes. Today, the majority is simply possessing space. This committee, this Congress, the American people deserve much better.
We're meeting this morning to consider reconciliation recommendations in response to the $1 billion deficit reduction instructions pursuant to Section 2002 of the fiscal year 2016 concurrent resolution on the budget, S-Con Res 11. First, we will consider legislative recommendations relating to the repeal of certain excise taxes enacted in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Then we will consider legislative recommendations relating to the repeal of the Independent Payment Advisory Board. The committee will now proceed to consideration of budget reconciliation legislative recommendations relating to the repeal of certain excise taxes enacted in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you may begin when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Levin. The members have before them Joint Committee documents JCX 127, 128, 129, 130, which provide descriptions and the staff's estimated budgetary effects of the recommendations in the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In brief, under the Affordable Care Act, effective in 2014, there is an individual mandate which requires individuals to maintain minimal essential coverage for themselves and for a dependent, and failure to do so is subject to an excise tax. Likewise, effective in 2014, large employers could be subject to assessable payments if one or more full-time employees was certified as receiving premium assistant credits through an exchange with the assessable payments, depending upon the nature of insurance that the employer did or did not offer to employees. The proposal before you would repeal both of the mandates and their related excise taxes for months beginning after 2014. The proposal would also repeal the 2.3% excise tax which the Affordable Care Act imposed on medical devices. This repeal would be effective for sales beginning in a calendar quarter beginning after the date of enactment. And the proposal would also repeal the excise tax on so-called high-premium health insurance plans. This excise tax, as you know, is a 40% excise tax on premiums above a threshold amount. This tax is scheduled to commence in calendar year 2018. Along with this provision, the proposal would repeal this provision, and the proposal would also repeal a reporting requirement that requires that the value of employer-provided insurance be included on an employee's W-2 wage and tax statement. The repeal of the reporting requirement would be effective for years after 2014. That concludes my brief description of the recommendations before you. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Any questions for Mr. Barthold? Mr. Rangel.
Sir, could you tell
You
me,
want to turn your mic on?
Mr. Chairman, I miss what part replaces what is being repealed. I didn't see that part in the bill as to what provisions of health care replaces the dismantling of the Affordable Care Act.
Mr. Engel, the provisions before you repeal certain requirements of the Affordable Care Act. It leaves in place a number of the other provisions that were enacted at that time.
Well, if I understood the chairman correctly, he said once and for all we will dismantle the Affordable Care Act. So I assume that if this dismantles it someplace in the bill, there would be a replacement for the health care that would be provided. Is that correct?
Mr. Rangel, these provisions are the excise tax provisions related to the individual and employer mandate, the excise tax on medical devices, and the excise tax on high premium health insurance plans.
So what you're saying is that while the chairman is correct that this would dismantle the health care system as we know it today, it does not provide for a replacement. Is that correct?
It would change the overall effect of the law that was enacted several years ago. Yes, sir.
No, I'm saying it would not replace the health care that was provided in the law that was passed.
I'm not a healthcare expert, but these provisions do not directly relate to the provision of health services. They relate to requirements that individuals purchase minimal essential coverage or that a provider be subject to the excise tax on high-cost plans.
Is it your expert opinion that if we repeal all of these provisions that's before us today, Is it your expert opinion this will have no impact on delivery of health care to millions of people?
Mr. Rangel, again, in terms of health care,
Yes.
it does not dismantle other parts of the Affordable Care Act, some of which Mr. Levin had mentioned, such as some of the requirements on
not
what
talking-
insurance companies offer in terms of plan coverage.
What part of the healthcare system would be changed as it relates to the delivery of healthcare? Because all of these things are just technicalities. The ultimate goal is to provide healthcare, and obviously these things are expensive support for a healthcare system. How many billions of dollars is removed from the system? And is it your expert opinion that without these provisions, we should be able to continue to provide the health care for the millions of people?
Is the gentleman ready for my admonition yet? You're going, he's the head of joint tax.
I think he's.
These are technical questions. You're going
I know.
beyond the scope. You're going beyond the
I-
scope of the walkthrough.
I withdraw my question. I apologize,
All right.
Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Dr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. We only got this bill a little bit ago, and so I'm not sure I understand all of how it works.
You know how it's
But in repealing the individual mandate, is there any provision that affects the guaranteed issue by insurance companies? In other words, will insurance companies still have to issue insurance to people no matter what their condition is?
There's no change to the requirements enacted in the Affordable Care Act related to what insurance companies have to provide. This repeals the individual mandate, which says that an individual must maintain minimal essential coverage, and if in the absence of maintaining minimal essential coverage, there's an excise tax imposed. The individual may choose not to carry coverage and would not be subject to the excise tax. That's the effect of the first provision. It does not mean that the insurance that's offered in the marketplace, that the modifications made by the Affordable Care Act with respect to insurance that can be offered are changed.
So the insurance company would still have to offer insurance to someone no matter what they had. Nothing in this bill changes that. That's what we have right now in the law.
That's correct, sir.
So this doesn't tamper with that at all. Now, in the case of the family who has a 22-year-old that's just gotten out of college and they're now out in their first job and they don't have insurance in their job because it's not part of the benefit package, the parents can now carry that child on their insurance to age 26. Is there anything in this bill that takes away that provision? Or does that require insurance companies to keep
The age
covering
26
26-year-olds?
The age 26 requirement is unchanged by this proposal.
So the insurance company will have no ability to underwrite, as you're saying it, because they can't ask any questions about what kind of problems you have. Only they've got some things in the law about age and a few things like that, but they don't have, if you've got cancer, you can go in and tomorrow and get a policy, right?
The provisions of law affecting pre-existing conditions are unchanged by this proposal, sir.
And the same is true for students or young people to the age of 26.
That's correct, sir. It's unchanged by this proposal.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Mr. Doggett. Oh, sorry.
Mr. Barthold, you're involved here because you looked at the revenue effects of this measure, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Doggett.
And in looking at the revenue effects, do I understand that one provision of the bill saves the government, saves the Treasury some money, and that's about a total, I think, of about $311 billion with regard to the tax credits that are available under existing law?
The revenue analysis that we've provided, and this is joint work with the Congressional Budget Office, it involves a reassessment of individual and employer behavior under these
You
provisions.
estimate, in short, that there'll be about $311 billion less in premium tax credits if this bill is passed than under existing law.
There'll be fewer premium, yes, there will be fewer premium tax credits. I'm
Well,
not
whether
sure about the 311.
whether you agree with that specific number or not, we're talking about billions of dollars in tax credits that the government will save on if this bill is approved. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, Mr.
And
Doggett.
under existing law, I'm sure you often do distributional analysis of who is getting a tax credit means that some folks are advantaged over others. We consider them all the time in this committee, and you evaluate them all the time. What income range receives these tax credits that we're about to eliminate?
The tax credits are, one is eligible for tax credits based on the individual's income relative to federal poverty guidelines.
Right.
With subsidies being available up to 4 times the federal poverty.
That's from about what income range to what income range?
You done?
No, I'm waiting for an answer.
Up to at least $60,000 for a family of 4.
So from what level to $60,000?
15 to 60.
And the lower you are on that scale, the more credits you're entitled to.
That's correct, sir.
So if you were looking at this bill from a distributional point, the people that are being asked to pay for a significant portion of it, I believe an estimated total of $311 billion are your working poor from around $20,000+ to $60,000, right?
Again, the poverty level figures.
Yes.
Yes.
Was there any distributional analysis done here to see who was going to be sacrificed in order to pay for this bill? Because it looks to me like it's working poor people, some middle-class people, and those who are trying to climb up the economic ladder to get into the middle class, that you're going to take away $311 billion in tax credits, in tax relief for those families, thousands, tens of thousands of families in my home state of Texas. You're going to eliminate that in order to do some other things.
The gentleman's question is going beyond the scope of the
No,
law.
it's going solely to the...
I would remind you to limit your questions to those that are technical in nature.
Well, my technical questions are solely technical. They relate to who pays and who benefits. The kind of distributional analysis we often do on tax changes, and I can't get an answer on the exact number. I believe it's $311 billion that you're going to take away was from someone, and I'm trying to find out who it is, and I think it's people in the $20,000 to $60,000 range who will lose $311 billion. And if that's inaccurate, I'd be pleased for the witness or the chairman to advise me.
Well, Mr. Doggett, just to clarify, the outlay savings are approximately $60 billion in terms of exchange subsidies, but there are also savings in terms of reduced payments under Medicaid. And again, Medicaid, as you will observe, as you know, is based on income relative to federal poverty line. In answer to your question about distributional analysis, my colleagues and our colleagues at the Congressional Budget Office have not prepared a distributional analysis of the proposal before you at this time.
What income level do you affect on Medicaid then, and how are those savings achieved on Medicaid?
No, it's comparable. Fewer people will be eligible for Medicaid.
How many?
5 million fewer under Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program.
Time for the gentleman has expired. Are there any further questions? Mr. Brady.
Mr. Bartold, I understand this package includes a number of bipartisan provisions, tax provisions that have passed this committee and some in the House in a bipartisan way. The medical device tax, which is sending American jobs overseas in rapid fashion. The Cadillac tax, which really is just a tax on working families in America, again, very strong bipartisan support for that, as well as elimination of that 15 panel unelected bureaucrats that essentially take power from Congress and this committee and make reimbursement cuts in the future. And the elimination of those provisions, again, which have bipartisan support, create a savings. Is that my understanding?
Both the repeal of the medical device tax and the repeal of the excise tax on health insurance premiums reduce federal revenues, sir.
May I ask as we take up reconciliation, the rules of that are there must be direct budget and spending impacts going forward through the Senate. And while in putting Obamacare together, there was in a closed room behind closed doors, special provisions added with direct budget and spending provisions. By contrast, this approach takes a very open process. And when you are asked, does this include a repeal or a replacement of the Affordable Care Act, my understanding is that reconciliation and the Byrd rule that accompanies it in the Senate is a very limited restriction, direct impacts on budget and spending. Is that your understanding?
I'm not expert in the parliamentary rules of the Senate, but that's my general understanding, Mr. Brady.
And I think that's the point here, is that this isn't policies unrelated to these issues, but that have to have complete direct impact on that budget and spending, which is why I'm really pleased, Chairman, that this package has a number of bipartisan issues and very clear choices about where we stand on this issue. Chairman, I yield back.
Any further questions? Mr. Becerra, I believe. Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, can we go back to a second, because you threw out the figure 5 million people who would lose coverage, and you said those would be people who are receiving health care with the assistance of Medicaid and Children's Health. Can you tell me how many children, as a result of this legislation, are going to lose their health care?
We don't have a breakout available, Mr. Becerra. The changes in the bill affecting prices and the individual mandate present a choice to families to be covered or not to be covered, to participate in some of these programs. So the bill does not affirmatively throw people out of a program, but it is a result of, that estimate is a result of an individual choice or a family choice. But I don't have the breakout that you're...
It doesn't throw them out, but it does result in them losing their coverage.
I agree.
Okay. And you said 5 million.
The estimate between under Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program is that in 2025, there'll be about 5 million fewer individuals with coverage under those two programs.
And you can't tell me how many of those individuals are children.
I cannot right now.
But you know that some children will lose their health care.
We estimate, our colleagues at the Congressional Budget Office estimate that that's the case, sir. Yes, sir.
That seems kind of strange that we're about to pass legislation that will have a devastating impact on their lives, and you're talking about kids, and we don't have the numbers. Yet we're moving forward with something that's going to impact, as you've said, millions of people. My understanding as well, pursuant to the Congressional Budget Office analysis, not yours, is that this could raise the cost of health insurance premiums by some 20% for many American families. That's not something you did, but that's an analysis by CBO. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, sir. It's joint work. We work with the Congressional Budget Office on the coverage analysis and the resulting participation in employer coverage, in exchange coverage, and the price effects.
And that goes, I think, to Mr. Doggett's earlier questions on the fact that by losing the tax credits, a lot of these families would no longer find the cost to be the same, and it would increase the coverage cost for them, and for many of these families, it would make the cost of that insurance unaffordable.
The price effect will lead to, and the repeal of the mandate will lead to a number of individuals not maintaining coverage.
Yeah. I have a number here, and I don't know if you have the information directly, but I have a number of 14 million Americans who would lose their health insurance coverage as a result of this legislation.
Well, the projection of my colleagues and those of the Congressional Budget Office are that the number of people without health insurance coverage in 2025 relative to current law projections would be reduced by about 15 million.
So 15 million people
individuals
by 2025 would end up without health insurance coverage. I don't know if you're able...
An additional 15 million.
An additional 15
Still
million.
project that even under present law, there will be individuals without health coverage.
Okay, so additional 15 million.
Would the gentleman yield, just for a question, it's really for you, just because I hear two things. One, I hear your point that a number of individuals be forced off or lose health care. I heard Mr. Barthold say, without the mandate, they will choose not to have health care. That is
Right.
too expensive, but they still have the tax credits. They still have all that still in place. The question is, no longer being forced by government-approved health care, they will choose for their families not to.
Right. I think the distinction is, it's like saying to somebody, you're going to have your wages cut, and so we're not going to force you not to buy milk. You just don't have the money to buy it.
Well, in this case, there are no changes in the subsidies.
Well,
So,
we would be changing the law, which, as we're hearing
not in
from,
the subsidies.
I would yield. I
Or
take
the
back
tax
I
credits,
take
correct?
back my time, and I would just conclude by saying that I think the important point here is that it'd be good to know who those folks are that are going to be losing out by this legislation, because we know it's going to be millions of people, including children. We know that millions of people will no longer be able to afford to keep their insurance coverage, and we know that a lot of people will have to pay a whole lot more as a result of this.
Time for the gentleman's expired.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Further questions? Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, I just want to see if I understand what your answers to these questions actually meant. There was focus on the 5 million fewer eligible on the one hand, but isn't the overall numbers 14 million people won't have health care if this bill passes?
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I actually had my notes jotted down incorrectly here when I told Mr. Becerra 15 million. 14 million is the correct answer. And that, just to be clear, is that in 2025, relative to current law projections, and current law projections also project that there will be people without health insurance coverage, that the number of people without health insurance coverage in 2025 will be 14 million greater than absent this legislation.
So it's a bit misleading to suggest that if folks, that this bill is not going to take away their coverage. If in the end, if this bill passes, how it happens is really irrelevant. If 14 million people, 14 million fewer people have health care, the end result is still the same. 14 million fewer people with health care. Is that correct?
14 million without insurance coverage.
And of the 14 million, we know that portion of them are from the Children's Health Program. That was those were the numbers that you were talking about in the 5 million number, correct?
Medicaid and Children's Health combined, approximately 5 million.
So of the 14 million, are there children who will lose their health care within that bigger universe?
The 5 million for Medicaid and Children's is a subset of the 14, sir, yes.
So the number doesn't, the number of children, the unknown number of children, because you don't have that information, doesn't really fluctuate depending upon the universe from which you're
The 14
calculating.
million consists of several different changes that will result because of the repeal of the individual mandate changes in prices and individual decisions. You'd have a number of individuals will lose employment-based, there'll be changes in employer-based coverage, and you'll have fewer individuals with coverage obtained in the individual marketplace, including purchase through the exchanges with the credits that are maintained in the law under these provisions.
Are the children who will lose their health care coverage the children of the families making between $20,000 and $60,000 a year?
That would generally be the case.
But we don't know the number of children from the families making between $20,000 and $60,000 a year. We don't know that, how many children.
I don't have a breakout on that, sir.
Can you get that number for us?
We'll see what I can do.
I would certainly like to have it before this bill is called for a vote. I think we're doing our constituents a real disservice if we take a vote on a bill that's going to lose God knows how many children their health care without having that number. And just the fact that we're going to take health care away from the children of people making between $20,000 and $60,000 a year.
I want to remind the gentleman, we're in the question and answer part with the Joint Committee on Taxation for technical questions.
I have a question. I'm waiting for the answer.
But the gentleman can move to strike the last word on the point, but technical questions to Mr. Barthold are what we're doing right now.
I will talk with my colleagues at the Congressional Budget Office, and I'll provide the best answer that we can to
Any
your question.
time frame on when we can find out how many children are going to lose their health care if we pass this bill?
I'll talk to my colleagues as soon as the markup concludes and I have a chance to sit and talk with them, sir.
Thank you. Yield back.
Any further questions for Mr. Barthold that are technical in nature?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Lewis.
Sir, let's look at the Affordable Care Act as a table, as a simple table made of wood with legs. This bill really is pulling the legs from under the Affordable Care Act. It is a deliberate, systematic attempt, not just to repeal, but to destroy the Affordable Care Act. I don't care how you put it. It is the wrong road to travel down, Mr. Chairman.
I would just ask the gentleman.
After we listened to the Pope last week, and if you're going to come here,
If the gentleman will
and
yield.
say to the children,
The gentleman, this is not a technical question. The gentleman is free to exercise his opinions when we're moving to strike the last word, but at this time, we're asking technical questions of the Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on
I
Taxation.
understand that, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's a waste of time for us to go down this road and not speak the truth.
I would encourage the gentleman to move to strike the last word and say that at that time. Any other technical questions? Mr. Levin's recognized.
We've been talking about the consequences of the repeal of the individual mandate. And I respect your effort, Mr. Barthold, to, how should I say it? Well, let me not characterize it. You're in a difficult position. In terms of the increase in premiums by 20%, that's the estimate of yourself and CBO. There's nothing so-called voluntary about that, right?
The basic analysis of premiums depends upon how, what sort of risks might be in the market that the insurance company has to try and cover. So as some people choose not to carry insurance, if the assessment is that those individuals tend to be lower risk individuals, and that might well be the case if the caricature is of the young person who thinks that they're impervious to any disease, they may see insurance as a wasteful expense. Were they paying in, their risk would be balanced out against an older person such as myself, who's less impervious to disease.
Okay, but my
And the
question,
insurance- and the
I
insurance
understand.
company's market judgment then would be that they would need to have higher premiums for those people buying insurance in order to break even or make a profit on their services.
So that result is on the people who are covered by insurance, and so that result is essentially incumbent upon everybody who's covered by insurance, right?
It's incumbent upon the mix of risk of those covered by
Okay, it's
insurance.
incumbent, I mean, it's what's going to happen. There's nothing voluntary about that. So I respect your effort to
Well,
try.
it's the work of the marketplace. I'm not. It's the work of the marketplace.
Okay.
It's market economics.
Do you have the figure on what would be the result in terms of the repeal of the employer mandate?
The analysis that my colleagues did was joint. We don't have it separated out of what's the incremental effect of the individual mandate, the incremental effect of the employer mandate. Those two were taken as a package in this assessment. One without the other would not. Well, I couldn't tell you what the split out would be if we did one and not the other, and it would be a different answer if you repealed just the individual mandate, not the employer, or just the employer, not the individual. So my short answer to your question is no, I can't tell you that, but I was trying to explain why.
Well, I mean, okay, this shows how this effort is playing with fire, and people they know who will get burned, and you can't give us the full impact in terms of numbers, which mandate affects whom, how many kids. Thank you.
There being no further questions, are there any further questions? There being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, does any member now seek to strike the last word? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel is recognized.
Even though, Mr. Barthold, you are here on the technical provisions of several bills, you cannot disconnect from the technicality the results as effect that these bills will have. Now, you say what is going to remain in the Affordable Care Act, but it's not just technical to say that if you take away the financial resources, then even though it may remain in the act, if it's unpaid, would you not agree that it is taking away that program and the delivery of services? These are resources that are necessary in order to comply with a larger bill. Like Mr. Lewis said, if you take away the leg here, the table is still there, but it has to fall. Is that outside the realm of technicality to ask you what happens to the Affordable Care Act if you remove the provisions that support it? Is that unfair to ask you that? You waiting for him?
No, he did seem to be talking to one of
say
his
it
staff.
again.
But no, Mr. Rangel, I have tried to explain how we see some of the price effects and the individual choice effects
Why don't you tell
affecting
us
the
that?
overall
Mr. Barthold,
budgetary effect, in that there is a loss of participation.
Let me try to get my time back, because the chairman is going to say that we should not be going outside of whatever. Could you tell us, as much as you feel that you can within the restrictions placed on your testimony, how these provisions would affect the delivery of health care to children and poor people and aged people to the best of your knowledge?
I would interject. We're past the walkthrough. The gentleman's free to ask him a question, but it's got to be technical in nature. He's not going to be able to tell you how this is going to affect health care for all children in America. He can answer the question about what does this policy do, and he's not here as a health care witness. He's here as a joint committee on taxation.
I don't think that you have the same appreciation of the skill of the witnesses that most of us do. He's been dealing with this for decades.
I appreciate his skills very much.
And when we have someone with his expertise that have worked on this area, in this area for ages, if anyone was to say, if you take away the gasoline, the car is not going to move, what is so technical about that? I mean, you can take away the motor and the car is not functional. Do you think that's an unfair question to ask, whether or not the Affordable Care Act, without getting involved with anything emotional, will be functional if you remove from it the resources that we have? Is that an unfair, non-technical question, whether or not
It's not his place to judge the fairness of your questions. It's his place to answer the technical questions you're asking of him.
Well, I hate putting you in this position, but it's not me as the chair. But I still know that I thank you so much.
Thank you. Anybody else move the strike last word? Dr. Bustani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this package. It's a really important package. But I want to focus my comments on the repeal of the employer mandate, which we already know from a number of sources is eroding wages, destroying jobs, and it has a particularly devastating impact at the bottom of the wage scale for those who are really struggling. And like the individual mandate, the employer mandate became necessary in Obamacare only because of other mandates, and especially price controls that have served to really destabilize the health insurance markets and destabilize the delivery of health care in general because of this mismatch between cost and reimbursement. Even left-leaning analysts have suggested the employer mandate's impact on the labor market is outstripping its effect on coverage. The oft-cited Jonathan Gruber suggested, and I quote, "The right way to think about the employer mandate is really as a revenue-raising tool. It does raise a lot of money." Well, it does, but it has a disproportionate impact on small businesses and on those who would like to see higher wages. This burdensome tax has real-world implications on workers, employers, and their families. It's more of a way to generate income than to meaningfully boost the insured population. We already know the cost of insurance is starting to rise precipitously again, despite the promises of Obamacare. The administration itself, and we've heard in testimony over a course of 2 years in this committee room, the administration understands the problems with the employer mandate, both if it were to be implemented and the complexity, and that's why they've chosen to delay it. We still don't know what the administration ultimately is going to do. I think this is now the time for this committee to act and to repeal this onerous mandate once and for all, and I yield back.
Everybody else move to strike the last word? I believe I have Mr. Lewis in the queue. Mr. Lewis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Director, the Affordable Care Act was passed by the Congress, signed into law by the President, upheld by the United States Supreme Court. And Mr. Chairman, and to all of the committee members, I think we have a moral obligation, a mission and a mandate to do the right thing. I've been sitting on this committee for a long time, and I cannot believe that we're going down this road. I cannot believe in my guts that we want to undo something that has helping people, that we want to repeal and destroy something that provides health care for our children, for the seniors, for those that have been left out and left behind. It's not the right thing to do. It is immoral. It's not becoming the Ways and Means Committee. I think we can do better, much better. Are you back?
Mr. Doggett, I believe, is next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So the bright idea in this proposal, this bill, is to pass a piece of legislation today that has the effect, according to objective experts, not to one party or the other, that has the effect of raising insurance premiums by 20% for those in the individual market over what it would be if this bill did not pass. The bright idea is to pass a bill today that will result in 14 million fewer Americans having health insurance. About 800,000 of those, by the way, are Texans. And about 5 million, we learned, though we got more questions today than answers, about 5 million of those are people that rely on the Children's Health Insurance Program or on Medicaid. As is so often the case in this committee, this is a measure to take from those in the 20 to 60,000 income range, the working poor, the folks that are struggling to get into the middle class or have just barely made it into the middle class, to take from them and to use it for other purposes. I think that is wrong. I think the gentleman from Georgia has it exactly right. It is wrong to pass a bill that has that effect, and that's what this bill is all about. They call it by a Washington name, reconciliation. That's close. But what it should be called is reconciliation, because it is a wreck for those 14 million families. It is a wreck for those children that have relied on the Children's Health Insurance Program, and it is a wreck for people that will be paying 20% higher insurance premiums than they would be if this bill were not passed. And of course, all of this is done in the name of repealing Obamacare, as if we had not been there before. With this, the 61st attempt to do that, I refer to these comments. At some point in time, you have to face reality. We tried to repeal Obamacare 50 some odd times in the House, and guess what? It didn't work. We probably should have figured that out after 2 or 3. Those are not the words of a Democrat. They are the words of our Republican colleague Mike Simpson of Idaho last week to Politico. But apparently in this committee, they haven't figured it out yet. As the chairman said, the goal here is to take apart Obamacare. Well, taking it apart has the effect of raising premiums and denying coverage. I've never thought that this law was as good as its detractors think it is bad. I think there are many things that need to be improved and strengthened in our health care law. But unfortunately, we've never been able to have an opportunity to come together to deal with any of those until last week when we got tax breaks for Tylenol. And that may or may not be a good step forward, but it certainly doesn't get at the core of one of the major omissions of this legislation, and that is the soaring price of prescription drugs. We need to have a full committee hearing on that subject. We heard recently about the impact of changing the cost overnight of one drug that was over 60 years old by 5,000%. An incredible increase. We have heard oncologists all over this country expressing concern about the fact that a diagnosis of cancer is not only a health diagnosis, it's a pocketbook diagnosis. It means you're probably going into bankruptcy in many cases, even if you have health insurance and drug coverage, because the cost of a regimen that might be $100,000 a year has an incredible effect. You see people mortgaging their homes. You see them going bankrupt and just hoping to be able to cling on to life for a short time longer. This impact, where in America we pay about twice the price of prescription drugs that most other developing countries pay, where we do not permit Medicare to negotiate prices for Medicare recipients, is wrong. And it is a major shortcoming in our healthcare system that this committee has some responsibility to address, and it has not addressed it. We could look at the shortcomings of the Affordable Care Act and see how we can do more to protect American families instead of denying coverage and raising the cost of health care, which this bill does. That would be progress. We ought to do it forthwith, and I yield
Time
back.
for the gentleman has expired. Mr. Kelly, I believe, do you move to strike the last word?
I do.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm glad the issue came up about pharmaceuticals, because I think this has become such a straw man argument, and we're always pointing to an instance where there's a 5,000% markup. I'd like to submit for the record an article out of the Wall Street Journal, September 28, 2015, called "The Biotech Route." We're quickly
objection.
reaching, without objection. And I think all it takes is somebody to read through this to see what really is going on. I mean, we can make these arguments and try to paint somebody as taking advantage, but without this innovation, without this ability to come up with ways of developing pharmaceuticals that help people, I think attacking them all the time, if it's always about they're charging too much, they're gouging, that's not an honest argument. We know that. It's one that plays well in the public, but we know it's not true. So I'd like to submit this, as I've already said, Chairman, and I yield back.
Without objection, gentleman yields back. Mr. Crowley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know there is a saying, and it goes, if at first you don't succeed, try again. But that's supposed to apply to learning how to ride a bicycle, not taking away health care from millions of Americans. Yet, once again, here we go again. The Affordable Care Act was designed to answer our constituents' problems, troubling affordable health care, having insurance companies make decisions on their health for them, not a doctor, and having nowhere to turn if they lost a job and the health insurance that came with it. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to think that the Affordable Care Act is the answer to their own problems instead of their constituent problems. To distract from their lack of vision and a real agenda for the country, they go back to the same old worn-out efforts to undermine the Affordable Care Act. But today's bills are somehow supposed to be different. They're dressed up in a process known as reconciliation. I think most people, when they hear the word reconciliation, they think of two sides coming together. Or maybe they think about someone reconciling themselves to a reality they have to face. The fact is, those interpretations could not be farther from what the majority is trying to do today. They're not trying to reconcile with us and work in a bipartisan way, despite the pleadings from the Pope last week. They're digging in just to please the most partisan flank and trying to keep putting political points ahead of the cause of the American people. They're not adapting themselves to the reality that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land and that it is helping people access quality, affordable health insurance. They seem to think that if they shut their eyes and keep bringing up these tired bills, that they can pretend they're somehow serving their constituents. This markup is another way of avoiding the things we really should be doing and what we need to be doing for our economy and for our constituents. Our constituents need jobs. They need an infrastructure bill. They need to repair their roads, bridges, and tunnels. They need fair wages. They need to see their income rise. All those are more important than yet another attempt to take away health care from hardworking Americans. So no, what we're doing here today should not be called reconciliation. At best, it should be called procrastination. But there is another usage of the term reconciliation. Given the Pope's recent visit, Mr. Chairman, I know that you are familiar with the sacrament of reconciliation. Confessing one's sin is for my Republican colleagues to come clean and be straight with the American people about what this will do if these bills were to be passed to hurt the least amongst us, the children of our country, if this became law, seniors in our country, if this became law. Maybe that's the term of reconciliation you should be thinking about, and not the technical term we use here in Congress. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome, my son.
Ms. Pasquarelle is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first of all apologize to Mr. Baltard. Mr. Baltard had come before us many, many, many times, and I know that you feel like you're in the middle of the vice, in the middle of this congressional debate, which you've been hearing on and on again. So I'm sincerely say I apologize to you. It may be your job, but you've been asked the same question so many times. And I don't know how you sit there so calmly. I really don't. We are being moved, Mr. Barthold. And this group, my friends on the other side of the aisle, are being moved by a new breed of pedantic anarchists. In 2013, the Tea Party was very clear in presenting what the manifesto was. Manifesto by Matt Kibbe, K-I-B-B-E, on February the 14th, 2013 said, conservatives should not approve, at that time we were talking about a CR, continuing resolution, and we will be eventually there, unless it defunds Obamacare. This includes Obamacare's unworkable exchanges, unsustainable Medicaid expansion, and the attack on life and religious liberty. Today's a markup. Just another capitulation by my friends on the other side of this aisle. Why are you afraid? The song we sing on Sunday morning in church, Be Not Afraid. I love that song. I'm sure you do too, Mr. Chairman. Why are you afraid? You afraid to be primaried? You'll all win if you stand up on your own 2 feet. You're holding government funding hostage in exchange for implementing policies that decimate the Affordable Care Act. This isn't the first time. 2 years ago, the political brinkmanship of shutting down the government over ACA cost our economy $24 billion, need I repeat, resulted in the creation of 120,000 fewer private sector jobs. Some Head Start programs had to temporarily close. This is not a joke. This is serious business we're talking about here. The human casualties need to be some part of the equation. That's not your job, Mr. Baltoy. That's not your job. I'm disappointed to say that we will probably be here again in December, when in December 11th, a day of infamy, only 4 days past the day of infamy, and on December 11th, we're also going to have to deal with the debt limit. Try that out for size. Enough is enough. My friends on the other side of the aisle need to let Congress do its job. Let's be clear what we're doing here today. Republicans are trying to win votes to perform the basic congressional task of funding the government by implementing priorities and policies that would, one, cause 14 million Americans to lose their health insurance, increase premiums in the individual market by 20%, allow corporations and other large employers to shirk their responsibility in providing health insurance to the employers. And one of the things we're doing, we're trying to take away part of the revenue, that's not this bill particularly, on the medical device tax, which I'm not going to get into right now, I don't have enough time. They agreed to it at the time. The ACA's tax on the medical devices, their net sales have increased 43% from 2005 to 2014. Look, I urge my colleagues to stop this charade so we can focus on the funding of government and the many other priorities. Do not be afraid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time for the gentleman has expired. Mr. Teaberry is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How appropriate that I follow my good friend Bill Pasquarello. I'm not afraid of the Tea Party, and I wish Father Joe were still here, because the irony about the Pope visit that some of my friends seem to forget, as a Catholic, the Catholic Church has a lawsuit against Obamacare right now. The Perfect Affordable Care Act. The Catholic Church has a lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act. Do we forget about that? It's not a perfect law. It's far from perfect, actually.
Well, my friend yield.
So I will at the end.
Thank you.
But it's far from perfect, and it's not about the Tea Party. It's about real people. And we have fundamental disagreements. I sat here when you all passed the Affordable Care Act, and there's some good things in it, but there's a lot of things that aren't good in it. I know you guys tried to get negotiation of prescription drugs, and there's an argument for that. But there's a real argument against that impact real people. Let me tell you about my 82-year-old dad, who's a U.S. Navy veteran, an immigrant to the country. You all remember that. But he's a U.S. Navy veteran. He's got a service-connected disability. There's a prescription drug that he needs to take that he can't get at the VA. Why? Because they negotiate, and that particular drug that they negotiate, they don't carry. That's the other side of negotiation that my friends don't talk about, that have real consequences to real people. So I get really frustrated, too, when you all paint this brush that we're all a bunch of knuckleheads.
That's not what I said.
I didn't say that, but we don't all worship to the Tea Party. There are people who have problems despite the Affordable Care Act. Let me tell you a real story about a lady at a grocery store that I go to. She worked at a grocery store in the bakery. She had really good health care. She had really good health care. And she had a disease I'm not going to talk about that was covered by this health care before the Affordable Care Act. Guess what? After the Affordable Care Act and some of the, I will say, unintended consequences of the Affordable Care Act, she lost her health care. And now she's in the exchange. She also lost the number of hours she worked at the bakery, so she had to take a second job. She was pretty upset about it. She actually cried to me about it. You people in Washington don't understand what real people have to go through. And you think everything is great by passing this big bill. Well, people like me have had consequences to it. So, while I think there are some good things in the Affordable Care Act, I don't judge all of you for signing up to my belly button tax. There are Democrats on that bill. It doesn't have jurisdiction in this committee, so it's not in this bill. But I know some of you think that's bad. I know some of you think the Cadillac tax is bad. I don't judge you and say, you know, you are being duplicitous. I don't judge you. There are problems. And you know what, guys? Not once has this president, and I agree with you, Mr. Pasquarello, we're not going to repeal Obamacare with Obama in the White House, but not once has this president had to veto anything with respect to this bill. Not once. This is one ability for us to get something to his desk so he can veto, and maybe he will sit down with us and negotiate the problems of the Cadillac tax, the problems of the medical device tax. I will yield 1 minute to my colleague.
Thank you. You know the great respect I have for most of you on the other side, probably all of you. This is not the question. No one was painting with a wide brush. But I'll say this to you, my friend from Ohio. You are not finding common ground when you undermine the center, the core, the essence of what you're trying to find common ground on. You're not doing it.
Taking back my time,
please.
You are talking to somebody who's accused of being way too much in the center. And to find common ground, you have to have somebody in the House, in the White House, and somebody in the Senate to actually have a dialogue with respect to common ground. But when people in those institutions say there's not a problem with the Affordable Care Act, we are left to our own devices. And we have to engage this president on this issue. And this is 6 years since Obamacare has passed. 6 years. And we have had zero voice. Zero voice. I sat in this committee, and with all due respect to my friend, I wasn't asked for any middle ground center approach to the Affordable Care Act. Zippo. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, balance his time. I think we had, Mr. McDermott, did you want to strike the last word? Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that's missing here is a hearing. Everybody's asking questions of Mr. Barthold. He has no information about it. We could have insurance people out there telling us something, or we could have hospital people. We could have a lot of people telling us, but there is a feeling in this committee, as I listen to it, it sounds like there's no U.S. Senate, that this bill's going to pass out of here and go straight to the president's desk. Now, I hate to be a civics teacher, but there are two bodies. This is going to die in the Senate, and let me tell you why. And I'll give you a real-world example of why it's going to die. Washington State Legislature passed a bill in which they provided universal coverage for everybody in the state of Washington. And they said to insurance companies there had to be guaranteed issue. So away they went, the state of Washington, and there was a bunch of people yelling up and down about universal coverage, and maybe we should get rid of that. So they repealed the requirement for an individual mandate in the state of Washington. But they left in place the guaranteed issue. That meant that every insurance company that was offering an individual policy could not deny coverage to anybody. What happened within 6 months was we had no individual policies in the state of Washington. They were gone. Now, if you'd had a hearing, somebody would have told you that's what's going to happen. You cannot have insurance companies forced to give policies to anybody who shows up at the door at any time they want. They get the diagnosis of cancer, they say, hey, Sally, we got to go down and get some insurance. Let's go right down. They have to issue it to us. And you think insurance companies are going to sit still in this country and offer individual coverage? They clearly are not. Now, the irony of this whole business is that once upon a time, there was a Republican who had some brains, and he was very smart. His name was Richard Nixon, and he proposed an employer mandate as an alternative to single payer. The Heritage Foundation, with the support of a guy that some of you may remember, a guy named Newt Gingrich, championed the individual mandate in the 1990s. So I suppose we would write off Richard Nixon. You know, he had his problems. And Mr. Gingrich, we got rid of him. One speaker here today, one tomorrow. They go down the line when they come up with ideas like this. Jim McCreary sat right here as the chairman of this committee. He and I wrote an article in 1987 in the Atlantic Monthly, or 97, excuse me, and talked about what had to be in a bill that works for this country. He agreed to an individual mandate and to a employer mandate. If you don't want a single-payer system, then you have to have individual mandates. So I presume that what this is the first step moving down the line towards single-payer. Let's get rid of this stuff that Obama put in, and we'll come back with a bill. Even Mitt Romney had an individual mandate and an employer up in Massachusetts. I mean, any thinking person who looks at how this system works realizes what you're doing is doing your 65th attempt to unravel this whole thing. And it's like kabuki theater. You're putting on this show today, and everybody's looking at it, and they think it's for real. This is not for real. This bill isn't going anywhere. It may go to the Rules Committee. It may actually come out on the floor, but it's never going to make it to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Because the Senate is smart enough to recognize that this is simply would destroy the insurance industry if they did it. And you watch. The reason the insurance people aren't in here yelling and screaming today, or they're not calling to our offices, is because they know it's nonsense. They're not wasting their time on this. John said we shouldn't be wasting our time. It's the gentleman from Georgia. Well, we shouldn't be wasting our time on it. If you have a real alternative to the ACA, bring it out here. We've been waiting for 5 years for it, and you don't have one.
Time for gentleman's
You don't want to
expired.
cover people.
Time for the gentleman expired. My understanding is Mr. Davis is the last one on that side of the aisle looking to seek to strike the last word. Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, here we are again. Spending time, wasting time, trying to repeal a bill that has reduced the uninsured by 18 million people. Now we're talking about taking coverage away from 14 million of them. When this bill, of course, reaches the floor, it will be the 61st vote to repeal the ACA. It will be the 61st wasted effort, and it will be the 61st time we could have been voting to boost economic growth and create jobs and work opportunities for those who are unemployed. This bill will increase premiums and reduce or take away coverage for millions of America. Some have called it, and I call it, an exercise in futility. It is not what our committee should be focused on. If we wanted to help American citizens and our national economy, we should be focused on creating jobs and strengthening families and communities. A few weeks ago, the Census Bureau reported that 1/5 of children in the United States live in poverty. 37.1% of African American children and 31.9% of Latino children. Rather than trying to undermine the health of tens of millions of Americans, we should be incentivizing businesses to hire hard-to-employ workers through the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, helping distressed communities with the New Market Tax Credit so that the hungry and struggling have strong communities and good jobs. We should be improving the incentives for low-income housing, rather than trying to give businesses a pass on contributing to the health and well-being of our society by pocketing profits rather than providing health insurance for their hard-working employees. Our committee should prioritize the permanent extension of the Earned Income Tax Credit to help working poor afford food and other basic necessities. We should help low-income Americans work by permanently extending the improved child tax credit so that Americans can work. The Earned Income Tax Credit expansion expires in 2017 and will harm 500,000 families. That include 900,000 children. Rather than targeting middle and low-income Americans by stealing their health insurance, shouldn't we seek to close tax loopholes that allow multi-billion-dollar companies from pretending they are foreign entities to avoid tax? No, I don't think this will go very far. The Affordable Care Act is here. It is here to stay, and I think that we waste not only our time, but the American people's time by trying to take away from them something that is greatly needed, and we must continue to hold on. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Seeing that there are no other members, I will move to strike the last word and then proceed to the vote. I've heard a lot. This is a fairly familiar debate. It is not settled law. This is our strong opinion that this should not be the settled law of the land because we think this is a terrible law. We think the architecture of this law is so fundamentally flawed. I think about the promises that were made in selling this law. By the way, many of us were here at the time. This wasn't a consensus effort. This wasn't a common ground effort. This was, you got a supermajority and you jammed it down our throats. That's how this law passed. And then used reconciliation to finish the job. I see a promise that was made, which I remember the president saying very specifically. This will lower people's premiums on average $2,500 a year. Anything but. You know who I'm thinking about right now as we have this debate? I'm thinking about a buddy of mine I talked to on Saturday at home, a guy I grew up with who's a painting contractor. In Wisconsin, you can't paint year-round, just so you know. We have snow on the ground 5 months out of the year. So you have a narrow window to do your painting. So he ramps up his business, hires a lot of people who work long hours in the warm summer months, which are only a handful of months, and then he has to slim his business back down. He is now waking up to the reality of the employer mandate. And his accountant is telling him, you either grow dramatically, find work in the winter to keep your business growing, borrow a bunch of money, hope that you can grow your business, or close down shop. This is the decision he is facing right now because of this employer mandate. He thinks he's going to lose his business because of this law, because of this proposal right here that we're repealing. I look at the individual mandate. It basically says is, we're not going to have competition, we're not going to have choice, we're going to make you buy what we say you have to buy here from Washington. We can do better than that. So what the law does is it makes health insurance much more expensive. Mr. McDermott said it as much with guaranteed issue and all these other mandates. We're going to make everybody buy it, and then we're going to subsidize it for some people. There are other ways of solving this problem. We believe that there are better ways, and we did in 2010 offer alternatives to having universal access to affordable health care, including for people with pre-existing conditions, without this costly government takeover and these costly mandates. Look at the Cadillac tax. How many people have you talked to in your constituency who sees this tax coming and is really afraid of losing their health care benefits? How many employees have been told, come 2018, you're losing your health care plan because there's no way we're paying 40% tax on top of this? Medical devices. Why on earth would we want to put a tax on life-saving medical devices and a tax on an industry that's a worldwide leader that we are now pushing overseas? These are ridiculous. So this is not settled law. We do not believe in these policies, and we think we should get rid of them. And by the way, this process, which we call reconciliation, I know it's an obscure budget process. It will get this to the Senate. We will. I know we tried 61 times in the House, but we have not gotten one through the Senate. We believe with this tool, use reconciliation, which is a key component of the budget we passed, that we will actually be able to bring this to the Senate and have a vote in the Senate. We think that's fairly substantial. Yeah, maybe we had 61. I'm curious about that number and how you arrived at that, but they haven't had one. And the point we want to make here is this is not settled law. It isn't working well, and we can do better than this. My biggest fear is time. We're running out of time, and the collateral damage that happens between now and when we actually fully replace this law. Look at the insurance industry. How many insurers are going to be left standing at the end of the day? I mean, look at these mega mergers. It's crazy. They're basically becoming oligopolies who are running as de facto public utilities. We want more insurance companies, not less. We want more choice, more competition, not less. So when you take a look at where this law is going, it's going in a bad place. I remember sitting in that chair 5-6 years ago, a guy named Rick Foster. Remember Rick Foster? Impeccable credentials. Nonpartisan actuary at Medicare and Medicaid at CMS. I remember him sitting here, I remember this like it was yesterday, telling us that because of the way Obamacare works and the reimbursement projections on how Medicare will be reimbursing at Medicaid rates by the end of the decade, Medicaid will be reimbursing at Medicaid rates, and the exchange subsidies will probably be reimbursing at Medicaid rates by the end of the decade, talking about all the bankruptcies that are going to occur at the end of the day in the healthcare community. Talking about all the negative margins coming into hospitals, all the negative margins coming into nursing homes, and how they're going to go out of business. I mean, colleagues, we've got the baby boomers retiring, and we're not ready for them. We've got 10,000 people retiring every day in America at that rate for the next 10 years. And we've got this law that is being projected by nonpartisan experts that we're going to have more and more bankruptcies in the healthcare provider community, and we think this law is here to stay, it's the law of the land, and we're going to keep it, we disagree. That's why we're doing this. The question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee transmit the committee print related to the repeal of certain excise taxes enacted in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act as amended to the House Committee on the Budget in response to the reconciliation instructions.
The question is on transmitting the committee print as amended to the House Committee on the Budget. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and a roll call to vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Aye. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Dold? Mr. Dold, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? No. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Larson? Chairman Ryan? Chairman Ryan, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. The reconciliation legislative recommendations relating to the repeal of certain excise taxes enacted in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act as amended is ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the budget reconciliation legislative recommendations relating to the repeal of the Independent Payment Advisory Board. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Matt Hoffman, Staff Director of the Healthcare Subcommittee, to provide the technical description of the text. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. I'd also like to mention that we marked up this very bill in January, I believe. So we've gone through the technical walkthroughs and this exercise before. So for the members of the minority, this is the same bill we marked up fairly recently. In June, excuse me. Did I say January? June.
Mr. Chairman?
We'll get to the Q&A later, but this is reconciliation. This is
But to your point, why are we doing it again?
because we're reconciling. This is going to not to the floor, to the House Budget Committee. Mr. Hoffman, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The language before the committee would repeal the relevant provisions in the Affordable Care Act that establish the Independent Payment Advisory Board.
All right, are there any questions? No, we're not doing openings. Any questions? Dr. McDermott.
Refresh my memory, Mr. Hoffman. This independent board, what are we losing when we take it out of the law? They had the ability to do what?
The board would submit proposals, if required to do so by the Chief Actuary of Medicare, to reduce Medicare spending based...
What would trigger that proposal? Why would the Chief Actuary say, you guys got to put some proposals forward?
The Chief Actuary would calculate two metrics. One is relative to Medicare spending, and one is relative to an economic variable. And if there was more spending over the target area, then it would trigger IPAB to submit recommendations to Congress.
Over what target area are we speaking?
Prior to 2020, it's a combination of CPIU, so the inflation for urban areas, and then the medical inflation component of that. It's the simple average of that. Once we get past a certain date, 2020 or so, the target area, the economic measure, is GDP plus 1%.
So if the cost in healthcare went up a certain amount, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, what would that really look like? Has it happened?
It has not happened yet, no. So this year in the trustees report, every year in the trustees report, the actuary is required to make a determination using these two measures whether or not IPAB is required to submit a proposal.
So this was kind of a stopgap if costs got out of control. Is that what you're saying? I mean,
it would depend on the measures that OACT or the office, the actuary would calculate. But yes, if certain triggers were hit based on a mathematical calculation, then IPAB would be required to submit proposals.
And then submit proposals that had to go into effect, or the House or Senate had to vote on, or what was I mean, we got a lot of reports around here that are piling up. Everywhere you look, there's a report from the government agency for this or for that. This one would be one that had mandatory action, or was it just something they submitted to the Congress and said, would you like to look at this?
So it's submitted to Congress, and then if Congress does not enact those proposals by August of that year, then the Secretary is authorized to implement that legislation automatically.
So it's basically the Congress would have the ability to reverse or deny or vote down any proposals that have been made.
They would have to act.
They would have to act
before August 15th of that year, of the year that the plan is submitted. And if it failed to do so, enact legislation before that date, then the Secretary would automatically implement the recommendations from IPAB.
And what period would they have from the time the report was, what time?
So January 5th, so the Office of the Actuary would make a determination in the fall or the summer, the fall of the previous year. And then on January 15th, IPAB is required to submit its proposals. And then the following August, if Congress has not enacted that legislation, then the Secretary is authorized under the law to automatically implement those proposals.
So the Congress would have 8 months to reject them?
Correct.
We move at least that fast around here, I think, so probably 8 months would be enough if we really thought it was a bad idea. And if we didn't, then it would go into effect when?
That year, the Secretary is authorized to automatically begin implementation on or after August 15th.
Okay, so if the Congress failed to act, it would immediately go into effect and they'd start writing rules and regulations. How long does the rules and regulations process take?
It can vary depending on the rules and regulations. There's generally a 60-day window between the time a draft rule is proposed and then it's finalized.
So they'd write these rules and regulations, and then you'd have, how long comment period do you have?
It's the normal procedures, and it can vary in between 60 days or so, but it's at the discretion of the agency.
It's at the discretion of the agency. It's not written into the law.
I think it's about 60 days.
So you can't tell us how long it'll take to write the regs or how long the comment period would be. So it could be as much as another 4 or 5 or 6 months before anything happened. Is that correct?
So the recommendations begin implemented immediately, but they will go into effect. The recommendations are due to go into effect on January 1 of that year. So it's about a six-month window.
Oh, time for the gentleman's expired. Any more questions? Any amendments? Anybody wish to strike the last word? Mrs. Sanchez recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak about legislation to repeal the Independent Payment Advisory Board. I want to begin by saying that, I voted for the ACA. The ACA has been in place now for 6 years. And if anything, it's shown us that the law works. But despite the success of enrollments and the number of people that are now covered, it's clear the bill is not a perfect one. I don't think anybody on this side of the aisle ever claimed that it was. And certainly there are areas of improvement, and I'm committed to working to try to solve some of the issues that we find that are not so perfect about the ACA, and try to make sure that constituents have the world-class health care that they deserve. Repealing the IPAB and eliminating the board of 15 unelected and largely unaccountable individuals whose primary purpose is to cut Medicare is, to me, a no-brainer. That's why I was the Democratic lead sponsor on that bill, which had 235 bipartisan co-sponsors. But unfortunately, we're back here in committee marking up a bill that I think most of the committee agrees is good policy, but I can't help but think that this markup today is really just a political exercise, if you will, to paper over some of the divisions within the Republican Party, and it's not a real honest effort to govern. So as I did in the last committee markup of this bill, I will vote in favor of IPAB repeal today, but vote against it likely when this good policy is inevitably hijacked and packaged into a vehicle that is not good, and a vehicle that is simply used to placate the far right wing of the Republican Party. I have to just say, this feels like Groundhog Day over and over and over again, and I'm sort of disappointed that the committee is still playing bad politics instead of working on good policy. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back the balance of her time. Dr. McDermott, I think, did you want to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman, it's always a little bit deja vu all over again here. This is really another attempt to repeal a piece of the law, but it really is the Congress caving to pressure from industry and who stand to lose money from decisions that might be made by the IPAD. They're imagining this. There's no board. It's never been appointed. They've never been confirmed. It doesn't exist, but it's out there. So it's kind of, as I say, kabuki theater. It represents the most recent iteration of the congressional hostility toward independent data, evidence, and facts. It's a vote, really, for snake oil salesmen who in this country want even more control over what happens in healthcare. They don't want anybody to give facts. Now, the IPAD is an independent panel created by the ACA to formulate recommendations to address rising healthcare costs. And as was pointed out before, it's not been put out there. The board would keep a watchful eye on spending. If growth exceeded target levels, the IPAB would present proposals to the Congress. Now, we all know, we're sitting here one day from the end of the fiscal year. We can't even pass a continuing resolution around here till the last damn minute. And we're saying that we don't like this board because this board will put us against the wall. Well, that's what it was put in there for, was to put Congress against the wall. As health care costs continue to rise, projected at 20% of GDP in 2024, it's the responsibility of the Congress to find ways to get a handle on growth. Yeah, the iPad is really a modest, but one way to go about it. Now, it is a part of a long pattern that I've watched in this Congress. When I first entered the Congress, there was a bipartisan, bicameral body called the Office of Technology Assessment. The OTA was an independent, unbiased source of advice on matters relating to science and technology. We did some medical stuff in there. It was a committee of 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans, 4 from the Senate, 4 from the House, in both, and it was very balanced. Amo Houghton was the last chairman. It was an invaluable source that took politics out of science and provided facts and evidence and data that would make smart legislation. Now, one of the first things Newt Gingrich did when he came in 1995 was to eliminate the program. Ever since, the snake oil salesmen have had a dangerous levels of power around here. There's nobody to question their facts except young staffers who may or may not know anything, selling this body unsound policies and keeping us from addressing important matters. That wasn't the only time this ever happened. The Republicans did the same thing to the Agency for Healthcare Policy and Research, an entity that functioned wonderfully under the leadership of a man named John Eisenberg. The AHCPR provided evidence-based guidelines to physicians to determine what treatments and procedures were cost-effective for patients. It was an important tool to help providers and payers make decisions based on facts, data, and science. But when the AHCP concluded that doctors were performing expensively unnecessary back surgeries, the snake oil salesman who provided for these procedures found a favorable ear in the Republican Congress, Mr. Gingrich. They waged war on the program. They split it into pieces, slashing its funding by more than 20%. With help from Republicans in the Senate, we were able to save it from outright elimination. But to this day, the Republican budget proposes to completely defund its successor, which is the AHRQ. By voting to repeal the IPAB today, we are continuing this pattern. We are saying to the American people, we don't want facts informing policymakers. We're going to sit here in the Congress and decide we're going to pay for everything anybody can think of to do. And we don't want anybody to give us any facts about why that isn't a good way to spend money. We're saying we aren't serious. That's what the chairman is doing here. We are not serious about controlling costs. There's no other proposal put forward. Just let's get rid of this one. And we're saying we'd rather let the snake oil salesmen who come in here tell us we should pay for everything. Anybody who comes into your office and says, I got a device that works, we should pay for it.
Time for the gentleman has expired. Mr. Neal, did you want to move the strike last word?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have been against this from day one, to vote to repeal it. But I want to say this to our Republican friends. It is ironic that I watch you cave in on the line item veto, balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, earmarking, and then you complain about the tyrant in the White House, where you willfully and knowingly give away congressional authority to satisfy the moment, and then to come back and blame President Obama for many of the things that you give up without even a fight. So IPAB, in my judgment, is farming out our constitutional responsibility on expenditure. So I hope that the next time a member of your side stands up and proposes a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, one of you might have the fortitude to say, well, that's inconsistent with the position that we took on IPAB. That would go a long way toward addressing some of the rifts that the two parties feel about making it up at the moment and embracing what might play well to the pollster at the moment. It's just inconsistent because I'll say this to you. I opposed these things when Bill Clinton was president. George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. and been consistent on it. And I watched the other side acquiesce and then blame President Obama. Yield back.
I believe there are other members on the other side that wish to strike the last word. So, Mr. Levin, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Well, whatever we think about IPAB within our ranks, once it becomes part of the reconciliation bill, we're all going to vote no. And so separating this from the rest of the package is in that respect artificial. So whatever we do today isn't going to be meaningful as to what's going to happen when you package this all together. And I guess you're also going to package together a bill relating to Planned Parenthood. So that's what this is really all about. And let me just say, Mr. Chairman, we look forward to the debate on the floor. You spoke about what's happened under ACA. We'll take you on that. We will look forward to being able to point to the drop in the uninsured rate that has been dramatic, that hadn't happened, where you had 55 million people who went to bed every night, waking up with the horror of having no insurance whatsoever. The horror. The number of people who went into the marketplace, the number of people who became insured through Medicaid or through CHIP, 13 million plus. We'll look forward to that. To the millions, what was it? Tens of millions who became insured through their parents' insurance, who had no insurance whatsoever. And you can point to the person here or there who didn't want to buy. We'll point to the kids who had no insurance and who unexpectedly had an ailment, and a serious one, who now were insured and who were covered. And the millions of people with pre-existing conditions who could never get an ounce of insurance, not an ounce, who because of an ailment essentially lived day to day with the risk of becoming even more ill and having no place to turn. You talked about what you proposed in 2010. The disgrace of the Republican Party is it never came up with a comprehensive health care bill, never. So talking about health care, you essentially became Dr. No. And so we have these pieces, and IPAB is one of it, but I think you really said very clearly what your aim is, a bill to dismantle Obamacare. That's what you're intending to do. And so, Mr. Chairman, we look forward to this debate on the floor. I think you're probably right. It will pass. You will have won over with this bill enough votes to pass a CR. I think it's unfortunate you feel you need to bow down to the rabid right in order to get enough votes to pass a CR. We'll look forward to that discussion. And we'll also look forward to the discussion on the rest of these proposals. So let's proceed. We'll wait for you to bring this to the floor next week or the week thereafter after you've packaged it. I'll just ask my colleagues if they want a recorded vote on IPAB. I think it isn't very important because in the end, we're going to unite to vote against this reconciliation bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I will summarize by moving to strike the last word. I'd say a couple things to my colleagues. Number one, I understand members of the other side of the aisle don't like the substance of what we're marking up, but I would make the argument that the process of reconciling is a good thing to do. We have the 74 Budget Act, which gives us very unique tools that are too rarely used that we need to exercise. And so what we're doing here is we are marking up reconciliation instructions that were given to this committee by the passage of the budget resolution. We will mark this up and send it to the Budget Committee, which will be packaged and brought to the floor with the other committees who got similar instructions, the Commerce Committee and the Education and Workforce Committee. Then that will go to the Senate, and the Senate will do the same. This is a good process for us. This means we're actually using the Budget Act as it was designed. I understand members of the other side of the aisle don't like the substance, but I would just simply say, as a member who's been working on budgets for a long time, it's high time we get back into regularly passing reconciliation packages so we get the Budget Act working. That's point number one. Point number two, the substance before us. I take issue with Dr. McDermott's description of this. I think this is perhaps one of the worst parts of the Affordable Care Act. And I say that for constitutional reasons. It's much what Mr. Neal said, which is we are delegating our lawmaking power to the executive branch with this Independent Payment Advisory Board. So the Independent Payment Advisory Board says these 15 unelected people have this quota they have to hit. They have to hit a spending target, that if spending exceeds GDP plus 1, they have to come up with cuts to Medicare providers to conform to it. They'll come up with that, and if we, Congress, don't like it, we have to come up with a 3/5 vote to replace those savings from somewhere else within the Medicare system. And if we don't do that, we all kind of know how this would work, then it just goes automatic. Oh, and if the IPAB is not constituted, if they don't do it, then the secretary can unilaterally do this. So it goes from 15 unelected people in the executive branch down to 1. One of the founding principles of our Constitution is government by consent of the governed. And we have these checks and balances and the separation of powers for a reason, to protect our freedoms and protect our liberties. This Independent Payment Advisory Board does great violence to that principle. It does great violence to that check and that balance. And for just that reason alone, I think we should get rid of the Independent Payment Advisory Board. And I think I'm speaking on some bipartisan ground by saying that. So we will move this out of committee, send it over to the Budget Committee, and then we will have a great debate on the floor because we really do believe that this law, the entire law, is doing great damage. It is pricing health care out of reach for millions of people. It is hastening the fiscal problems we have in this country. It is reducing choice and competition. It is consolidating providers. It is denying choices for individual families, and it's putting businesses out of business, and it's pushing people out of their employer-sponsored health care. And we believe that we can do a much better job of achieving the goal we want to achieve, which is people getting affordable care, than having to do this. And so, yes, that is why we're going through the reconciliation process, to be able to actually get this through and onto the president's desk. And we look forward to the debate that's to come. Seeing that there are no other efforts to strike the last word, I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee transmit the committee print related to the repeal of the Independent Payment Advisory Board in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act to the House Committee on the Budget in response to the reconciliation instruction.
The question is on transmitting the committee print to the House Committee on the Budget. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The budget reconciliation legislative recommendations relating to the repeal of the Independent Payment Advisory Board is ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.